think the history of news is really interesting because news is defined totally differently by the people receiving the news, and it can be both local and international at the same time. And I think we're going to see an increase in that, and I have no idea how the people who are actually in the industry here feel about it. But news to my kids is very different, and they have a very, very localised way of travelling news, and it's usually text or hyperlinks between them about what is news in their locality. Now, that might be where the busies are, where the police are, usually because they're wanting to attract their attention, so they'll chase them because they're bored of chasing each other. So there are all sorts of reasons why they might want to do it. The most ridiculous venture they entered into was local weather. They decided they'd do the local Portsmouth weather, and one of them did a video every day of what the weather was going to be in Portsmouth. It became huge amongst school kids and whipped around, and that was incredibly local. At the same time as my 9-year-old daughter woke up the day after the American general elections, and the first thing out of her mind and the only thing she wanted to know was whether Barack Obama had been elected. And she sat there and cried as she watched his speech on the internet. So I think it's a real dichotomy of what constitutes news and what do people want to know. And I think there's going to be much more of a challenge. But I think what it's allowing people to do is to get the news that affects them. So kids want much more localised news. And so when you look at, is John Craven's news round going to have a lasting legacy, or are we going to want what's local for the news for those kids in those areas? I think there are real challenges, and I think it's one of the things that you'll be looking at more and more.
As you said, particularly local news provision has been defined by limits of physical geography in broadcast and the economics of print in terms of newspapers. They've gone now. We are in the midst of Gutenberg-esque revolution. And people can define their own locality and define their own news if they have the right motivation and they have the right skills. I'm an optimist about people's motivations to act as citizens, not just consumers. And that applies as much to sharing with each other what matters to them in their local area, call it news if you will, as it does to finding out about Obama via whatever means. I've just got one fear. And that's how sustainable it is. That's really the challenge. I don't know if there's a commercial model that'll work, that'll give you some sustainability, or a non-commercial model. I'm certainly very keen to experiment and risk some failures at a really enabling people to share knowledge and expectations about their communities very, very locally. Locally as defined by them, not as defined by broadcasters or newspapers.
The one thing that scares me about, the hyper-localization issue is, as you said, is this sort of the nightmare scenario of like the sort of the first wave of the web, where basically we sort of like turn back the clock 250 years, and the only world that we care about is the world that we can see immediately around us. I think news organizations are going through, a crisis like almost no other sort of media companies are. I mean, the cost structure of a news organization is so badly wrong for today's economy that the amount of cuts that need to happen in a modern news organization, sort of a 20th century news organization to survive into the 21st century, I mean, are scary to a level that most people won't admit to themselves, never mind to their staff or to the public. But I think what does happen when that happens, because it will have to happen, because otherwise these companies will die, is that it gets hollowed out on both ends. And on the global end, you have what's happening already. The aggregators, the Googles, the Daylifes, the Reuters, the Gettys, who are sort of the glue that gives you the international perspective. And then I think it's amazing what you're saying, because I think, hyper-local news, and there's service in the States called Outside In, which I'm sure that is addressing this issue. It's a critical part of the value chain, but I think in the same way that, Channel 4 sort of took a sort of let everyone else do the work approach to TV production, I think maybe news brands in the 21st century are going to do a let everyone else do the work approach to news production, and they're going to be the aggregators and the brands and the ad sales forces on top of that, because you just can't afford to support a cost base to supply the news that any one of us actually wants to have on a daily basis. It's just economically unsustainable without massive partnerships.